SECfans.com, week 10, and we are once again stepping outside of the SEC to discuss a big game externally. There's actually not that many great games in the SEC this week, a couple big ones. Penn State and Michigan. We've talked a lot about both these teams the last couple of years, and Michigan is on this upward arc, so we're going to talk about you some more. Michigan fans do know we did a hypothetical last week of your team if you played Ohio State that day, yesterday. Things have changed now. The numbers have changed. We'll actually discuss that game when it comes around, obviously, and the model will be updated. But if you want to hear an interesting discussion, we also talked about playoff potential for both teams, and I did have a little bit of a rant about scheduling for the SEC and Big Ten. But anyway, for those of you who are not familiar with our channel, we are not trash talkers. We're not here to blast the Big Ten or pump up the SEC. We are fairly objective. We're actually really objective. We're SEC fans, not SEC homers. We are a data-driven channel. We get nerdy every week, and we're going to do so right now. Josh is with me. He's a bigger nerd than I am, which is saying a lot. Michigan versus Penn State. We talked in the hypothetical about how, and don't want to kind of give it away for people that might want to go see that, but the hypothetical model said that Michigan would beat Ohio State by a pretty decent clip. We talked in that discussion about the fact that Penn State might actually have a better chance to beat Michigan than Ohio State. And not to say that Penn State is a better team. Obviously, we saw Ohio State win that game on the road. But to say that matchups and scheme fits in this game are a little bit more challenging for what Michigan is good at versus what they're bad at. So why don't we get this thing going by having that discussion in that why do we have this feeling that Penn State has a better shot at beating Michigan? Not saying they will, but has a better shot than even Ohio State at this point.
Well, I think to a certain extent because they do. But the first thing is, frankly, and maybe this video is a safe space, Ohio State's not a great team. And there were some signs of that statistically going into the loss to Purdue, and without going too much into it, the fact is that Penn State Ohio State in a lot of major rankings just wasn't rated that highly. I mean, they were rated, rated like 15th, I think, in FEI, somewhere around there. So there were signs that Ohio State is kind of flawed, and the problem is if you're flawed, then matchups start to matter a lot. And Ohio State's run defense is not fantastic. The defense in general isn't fantastic. And offensively, Ohio State's kind of limited in what they can do. And what that meant is when Ohio State plays Michigan, right now our expectation is Ohio State's going to let you move the ball somewhat. Michigan's offense is not great. It's good. It's not great. We did a video before the year, which hopefully people can forgive us because we've been very positive on Michigan since, kind of noting that Heisman talk for Shea Patterson was probably a little unrealistic. And we've noted that Shea Patterson's quarterback rating, I think last I checked, was within a point of, I think it was like 159 at Michigan. It was 158 at Ole Miss. It's kind of the same thing it was before. They're moving the ball. They're able to move the ball because they have a quarterback that can complete a forward pass, not something they necessarily had every year under Harbaugh, but it's not fantastic. But, against Ohio State, that's going to be enough to score some points. And likewise, against Ohio State, Michigan's defense is going to be able to more or less shut them down because Ohio State's so limited. Sometimes when you have a team like Penn State that is, maybe not as good as Ohio State, obviously they've already lost that game, but they're better and worse in different ways. And whereas Ohio State is good and not great kind of across the board, and it's hard to, the running game, the passing game, everything's kind of good but not great. Penn State is a lot more unbalanced. Their passing game is not necessarily consistent, but can hit big plays. The run game hasn't necessarily been great, but they don't really rely on it. And the defense has been more or less solid across the board, maybe a little better pass than the run. But the flip side of all that is Penn State can score points on big plays in the passing game, particularly because of McSorley. And you saw that in the Iowa game, right? That if you have a team that has some, a little bit of dynamic playmakers to it, the little bit of an explosive offense, which almost always comes from an explosive quarterback, you can generate 20 points without a lot of production, right? You can make a couple big plays in the game if you've got this wide open offense and a quarterback to run it. Up until last week, it was a comment we had about Texas A&M and the SEC that they scored crazily. They were scoring 20 to 26 points in every single game this year. A&M has up until last week when they fell flat on their face against Mississippi State, made us look stupid. But certain types of offense, if you've got a dynamic quarterback and that has a big arm, you can do that if you run a wide open offense. So what Penn State can do against Michigan is they can throw the ball vertically. They can try to generate big plays because Michigan's defense, like we've talked about for several weeks at this point, is elite. They're an elite run defense, 65% of opponent averages. They're an elite pass defense, 67% of opponent averages, which is phenomenal. So no one is going to move the ball consistently on Michigan. And if you try to march down the field, I'm not sure anybody in college football outside of a couple teams, maybe Oklahoma and Alabama, who are kind of on a different level than everybody else, is going to be able to do that with any consistency. So you're not going to score many points. What you need to be able to do is generate some big plays, get a safety matched up in coverage and try to hit a couple touchdown passes, take advantage of chunk plays because you're not going to move the sticks very well. So you need to score when you complete a pass. And it's pretty simple. We've all seen that as fans, right? You see an offense and they finally hit a big play in a game and the guy gets tackled at the 4 and you groan because you've watched the rest of the game and if you didn't score then, you're not going to score now, right? It was touchdown or nothing, dude. And you're not going to get points out of it. That's what Michigan's defense does to people. But Penn State's the kind of offense that scores the touchdown in that situation, not the kind of team that gets tackled at the 5.
So looking at this game, it's interesting to me because I think that we've seen so much consistency from Michigan's defense. And even against Notre Dame, that wasn't like, it was 24-17. We've talked about the jump ball, kind of 50-50 ball that Notre Dame scored on. The rest of the way, they've got 17 points for the rest of the game. They haven't seen a quarterback, and I don't want to call McSorley a dual threat quarterback. He's a quarterback who can run, but I think in a lot of ways, that's actually more challenging for a defense that has to defend a pass first guy that can completely, or that can still make something out of a pocket that completely breaks down, or still can have a random design quarterback run that goes for 51 yards like it did last week. Talk about that dynamic that Penn State brings to the table relative to what Michigan's seen this year, and the fact that Michigan is a very, very aggressive defense, and has a potential, when defense are really aggressive, has a potential for a running quarterback or a quarterback that can run to exploit that.
Right. So I think the trick here with Michigan's defense is when you're this aggressive, when you run a lot of blitz schemes, you do a lot of press coverage, what you can sometimes do is you can shut down an offense because they're just not able to really get anything going, right? They're not able to execute their plays, get timing down, the quarterback's being pressured, he gets rattled, everything falls apart. And there's a certain level in college football that if you can't hit the check down, if you can't throw the hot read against the blitz, really good teams can bring the blitz every play and you're never going to complete a pass. And one of our favorite statistics we bring up, and we bring up a lot, is Michigan last year, when they played top 50 offenses, was radically different defense than when they played top offenses. And Michigan's, I think, so I always forget this number, and I always ask you for it, but it was 32 points a game when playing top 50?
32.5 points a game versus top 50 offenses, and they played 3.
Right. So the problem is, I think Brown is so aggressive that he puts his guys in a lot of tough situations in the back end. And most teams aren't good enough to get the ball out, and especially to get it out accurately against those kind of looks. Penn State is. And so when they've played a top 50 offense, it's looked a lot different because it's basically the blitz doesn't get home. If you live by the blitz, you're going to live or die by it. And when the blitz is getting home, you look great. And when it doesn't, you give up a touchdown. you have to be good enough to ever keep the blitz from getting home against Michigan. It's a lot harder this year than it was last year because I think they're better than they were last year. The one team this year that had a quarterback that could actually was a little bit mobile, was able to get the ball out, was Wimbush at Notre Dame. And Wimbush had 7.7 yards per attempt. Wimbush is not a great quarterback. I mean, obviously Notre Dame benched Wimbush, but in that game, just his ability to sort of extend a play, move the pocket, hit a guy downfield. We talk a lot, and there's that some Notre Dame fans rag us about it. One in particular, that Michigan really was one jump ball away from that game being tied in the fourth quarter. But the flip side to that is that happened because of the way Michigan plays defense. I think that they give up a lot of jump balls. If you're able to extend plays and throw the ball down the field, that's how Michigan, Wimbush throws for 7.7 yards per attempt against Michigan, and then 5.3 against Vanderbilt. It's the style of defense, and that's a real concern against a guy like McSorley, who really outside Wimbush is the only guy Michigan's faced. Really the only guy they faced that is mobile and has a big arm. And he's considerably better than Wimbush is.
So one of the things that scares me a little bit if I'm a Michigan fan is the fact that, so I don't think Penn State has a really good defense. The numbers against, honestly, 24 to Iowa is not a great mark, especially given how Iowa didn't perform statistically very well and still managed 24 points. Should have had, in my opinion, 31 if the tight end is not blocking and actually turns around and catches a pass. But they're good, not great. And Michigan has stubbed their toe against good, not great defenses this year. So Michigan State is a good, not great defense. Northwestern is a good, not great defense. And you got 20 and 21 points there. So Notre Dame is actually, I think, a good bit better than them, and it was the first game of the year. So I give Michigan a little bit of a pass there. Shea Patterson's first game. Offensively, Michigan has feasted, to their credit, they have feasted against some terrible, terrible defenses. And so, a lot of times we bash some teams or knock them for not being able to take care of business when they play those types of teams. What happens in this game if Penn State is able to scrape together 27 points? Is Michigan offensively the type of team that can keep pace in a game like this?
So the first thing I want to touch on is Michigan State's defense, based off the comment you made earlier. So Michigan State is sixth in the country in yard per carry allowed. That's a really good mark. Some people have said they're the number one defense or rush defense. It's not actually true. Clemson is. There's several that have been better, including Florida State. But the flip side to that is Michigan State's pass defense has not been particularly good. So if you kind of balked a little bit at this idea that Michigan State's defense is good but not great, it's that they're 49th in the country in yard per attempt allowed. They are vulnerable in the passing game. Michigan really hasn't faced a complete defense all season outside of Notre Dame. Again, Northwestern has been pretty good, but they're not necessarily great either. We've already touched on the fact that we didn't think Wisconsin was great. So Penn State being solid on both sides is not all that different than Northwestern. And I think there is a concern that if they get into a game where, Michigan State, they were able to lean on the pass at times, 212 yards passing in that game, only 78 rushing, or excuse me, not 78 rushing, 183 rushing, 78 plays. I'm looking at the wrong stat. But Michigan was able to lean on the pass without throwing the ball a whole lot, be able to put up enough points. They knew Michigan State wasn't ever going to score. It was okay. Penn State is a better on both sides. They're not going to probably be able to lean on the pass the same way. And Penn State's pass defense, 80% of opponent averages, is quite good. So it's unlikely Michigan's going to throw the ball very well. And then the run game has not been good enough to carry it. So I do think there's concern, given the fact that 3 times this year when Michigan was held to something like 5 yards per play to 5 to 6 yards per play. It's only happened 3 times. 4.45 against Notre Dame, scored 17 points, 5.7 against Northwestern, scored 20 points, and then 5.1 scored 21 against Michigan State. So if they're getting under 6 yards per play, you can pretty much expect Michigan, based off past history, to score about 20 points. And that's a concern because I don't think Penn State's all that different from Northwestern defensively, maybe even a little bit better in terms of pass defense. And that indicates that Michigan's offense could be slowed down. And if you want to transition to it, the model ends up tracking that point, and it kind of brings it up as a big point of concern.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get into the model and see where the numbers take us.
So, turning to the model again, Michigan is an elite defensively both sides of the ball. 65% of opponent rushing averages, which is fantastic. 66% of opponent passing averages, which is phenomenal. Holding teams to under 70% is extremely hard in the pass game. A lot easier to stop the run than the pass in college football. Penn State's rush defense, 88% of opponent averages, is not great. It's merely good. To be a good, a great run defense, we want to see that number really below 80% or at least below 85. An okay to good run defense, it drops below 90. So they're 88% is a good number, but they're kind of teetering on just being above average, really. But pass defense, 80% is quite good. That's a very good pass defense from Penn State relative to opponent averages as a neutral number. And then when you sort of project that out against most offenses, I think an interesting thing a lot of people might not anticipate. Michigan's offense has a higher per attempt average than Penn State. Penn State has a higher per carry average than Michigan. I think the public perception is that Michigan would be the better run team and Penn State's the better pass team, just based on quarterbacks or tradition, name value. It's the opposite, actually. Michigan actually throws the ball for a higher per attempt average than Penn State and vice versa in the run. So you're kind of projecting it out. Penn State's not expected to be able to run the ball well at all in this game. Only about 3.7 yards per carry. Only expected to get 5.2 yards per attempt. Michigan, though, is not expected to be great either. Only about 4.4 yards per carry on the ground, 6.7 yards per attempt. That comes out to 5.3 yards per play for Michigan, 4.3 yards per play for Penn State. Those are low numbers. The problem the model sees is everything we were talking about before. What happens when these teams get held to really low averages? And what it sees essentially is that Penn State has found ways to score even without generating many points. Against Iowa, Penn State only had 4.88 yards per play, 4.9 yards per play. That's a pretty low mark. They put up 30 points in that game. So Penn State can score. Michigan, on the other hand, anytime they've been under 6 yards per play, they've scored right at 20 points. So what our model is saying, it's actually giving Michigan a little credit and says, Michigan, I'm going to give you 24 points off that 5.4 yards per play. Penn State, it gives 25. So our model actually predicts Michigan to lose this game 25-24. And it's essentially doing that because it says this is a very unproductive game for both teams in terms of offensive yardage. And it has more confidence in Penn State's ability to score with limited yardage than it does Michigan's.
How much of we can't weigh this really in the model, and I know Vegas the kind of trope is that they give 3 points for the home team. How much the fact that Penn State hasn't played anybody on the road? I mean, Pitt doesn't count, Illinois doesn't count, Indiana doesn't count, and they've had Ohio State, Michigan State, and Iowa at home. How much does going on the road to play at Michigan weigh into this game? And the fact that Michigan's one loss was on the road and maybe win that game if it's at home.
I think it does matter. We don't really factor in home field advantage in our model. There's a lot of reasons for that. A big part of it is that you have to do a tremendous amount of work on the back end to track it because some teams it matters, some it doesn't. But one time I will say it generally matters is certain blue blood teams like Penn State with big stadiums can get very loud and very intimidating. And it matters when you're a top 5 or top 10 team going into a hostile environment where they're jacked up to play you. If Michigan was playing in Penn State, it would be a big deal. The crowd was a major factor in the Ohio State game, I do believe. That game ended up being a loss, right? But it was still a very close game. I think it matters that it's at Michigan. It's going to matter. I don't know that Michigan is going to be super amped up for Penn State. I mean, it's obviously a big conference game. People are going to be very excited. It's not a top 5 team they're playing. It's not quite the same energy level, as let's say Iowa, when they, not Iowa, excuse me. I'm trying to think. I get all my schools confused sometimes, but the Purdue game when they're playing Ohio State, right? I mean, that stadium's rocking. Or Ohio State when they were at Penn State, the game's rocking. It's not going to be the same way at Michigan, but it will benefit Michigan in this game. And I think the biggest thing is being the top 10 team in this matchup. It's not going to hurt Michigan the way it would have hurt them if they were playing at Penn State.
You got your 30-point Iowa road losses mixed up, or Ohio State road losses mixed up. Iowa, Kinnick last year was rocking too when Ohio State got in there. All right, so given all of this and the fact that we're talking playoffs for Michigan, we're talking the division championship coming down in the Ohio State game, go ahead and give me your pick in this. I think it's interesting that Penn State, the model saw some things that we saw as well. Go ahead and give me your pick in this. Let me know what you think.
Yeah, and then before I get my pick, I'll note, so the model, I think we got some credence with Michigan fans because we were one of the few groups to pick Michigan to beat Wisconsin. The model had that game 40-13. The game itself was 38-13. I picked it 31-10, wasn't that far off. I do think Michigan wins this game. I don't have a tremendous amount of confidence in Penn State this year, having watched them a lot. Not going to make my in-laws happy because most of my in-laws are actually Penn State fans, outing myself a little bit. I was not and did not grow up a Penn State fan, but I watch a lot of their football games because of my wife. I think Michigan's an overall better team. I do think, like, if you go back and watch that Michigan State game, Michigan has held back a lot in a lot of those games. We've both been a little critical at times. And Michigan fans always kind of fight us on this. It bothers us both that Higdon has not been more productive than he has been. He's been good enough to get by, like 4.36 yards per carry against Michigan State, which was a good number. Again, top 10 rush defense. Our concern with that is you can't carry the offense on 4.4 yards per carry. The flip side to that, though, is, again, when they've needed to, they've been able to pass the football. 8.5 yards per attempt against Michigan State is quite good. And you can move the ball with 4 yards per carry well if you have that kind of passing numbers. I think Michigan sort of outperforms the model a little bit because they haven't really needed to use Patterson and haven't used him that much. And when they've needed him, Northwestern and Michigan State game, he's come through for them and found a way to win. So he's almost kind of held in reserve. I think the same thing happens here. I do think the model's right. This is a tough matchup. Michigan can absolutely lose this game, and it's going to be we talk sometimes, it's a high variability game. That Penn State's offense is a high variability offense. Michigan could win this game by 2 scores just as easily as they could lose this game by 2 scores, in my opinion. It's going to be really variable. But I think more likely than not, Patterson kind of in reserve gives them a little bit of an extra kick, some points the model doesn't see because they haven't needed it. I'm going to go with Michigan 27, Penn State 21.
I was torn on this one all afternoon when I was thinking about this because of some of the stuff we've talked about before. I was leaning towards Penn State. I think part of your lack of confidence in Penn State is the same in mine, in that we don't just look at your win-loss record and we don't just look at your best wins or necessarily ding you for losses against good teams. One of the things that we don't love is when you struggle with bad teams consistently. Iowa's not a bad team, but they're not a great team. Indiana's not a good team. And App State was looking okay until they got stomped last week. That win's not looking great. So for me, I really was thinking Penn State in this game because I think offensively they give Michigan some things that Michigan hasn't seen this so far this year. But then I go back to the fact that, one, it's at Michigan. I think that's a big deal. And two, I look back to this Ohio State Penn State game that was at Penn State. I don't think Ohio State offensively is as good as Michigan in terms of balance and consistency. I don't love some things about this Michigan offense, but right now I like Shea Patterson more in his offense than I like Haskins, and I like Higdon more, even though I think Dobbins and Weber are better running backs overall in terms of NFL prospects. They're not running well in that system. Whatever is going on in that system is bad. And And I think obviously Michigan's got a better defense than Ohio State right now. So I don't think Penn State gets the 26 they got against Ohio State. I do think it's an ugly game. I do think it's highly variable. I think this is a slog fest. Give me 24 for Michigan and 20 for Penn State, with a caveat that this could go either way. So I'll ask this, since we're both picking Michigan to win. Is this the playoff play-in game for Michigan?
Oh, that's kind of an interesting question. I think it may be. I think there's a solid argument that because of matchups, this is a harder game than Ohio State is for Michigan. I'm not sure. Obviously, Ohio State beat Penn State. We don't always necessarily buy that means you're the better team overall. But I do think it has a good chance of being the playoff game. It's a tough matchup. Kind of, again, when you're an elite defense, when you lean on being an elite defense, the thing that you don't want to play is an offense that has the ability to make dynamic vertical shots, because they can score points on you where most teams can't. That's what Penn State is. And if Michigan wins this game right now, and you can go back and watch our video, we've got a lot more confidence that Michigan beats Ohio State, honestly, than Penn State. So I do think it's true. But I do definitely think it's interesting. Both of us and our model are suggesting. I looked it up because we don't know. We do these videos on Sunday, and the models get posted usually this day. So, the odds. Michigan's an 11.5 point favorite in this game, and I don't see it. I don't see this as being an 11.5 point line. I definitely think Michigan could win this game by an 11.5 points because it's so variable. But I think this is a much closer game than maybe apparently some think because of the matchups involved.
All right. Anything else on this game before we wrap it up?
Nope. I think that we pretty much talked everything to death.
All right, y'all. Penn State fans, Michigan fans, you've heard from us already so far this year. We love to mix it up in the comments. We will also find you on your forums. We will also find you where you live, where you think you're safe from SEC fans butting in with their own opinions. Again, we're super objective, and I like the fact that we don't have a dog in this fight. So you've got to, there's no animosity towards either one of these teams for us, and we just kind of call it like we see it. So looking for an ugly one. But Michigan fans, tell us why we're wrong, why you're far better than Penn State. Penn State fans, tell us why we're wrong, why you think you're going to win. Mix it up in the comments, and we'll meet you there. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.